Afternoon. Let me welcome everybody. Thank you for choosing to spend this beautiful afternoon here with us to discuss what we think is a very important and timely topic. Let me begin. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least take a moment to acknowledge the tragedy in Brussels. Washington is such an international city, so interconnected. Maybe it affected some of you even more directly than the rest of us, but certainly from my institute, we offer condolences and thoughts and prayers in the aftermath of this awful tragedy. Today we're going to spend some time talking about China, the U.S.-China relationship, and our policy. 10 years ago, believe it or not, then Deputy Secretary of State Bob Zoellick gave a speech which subsequently became known as the Responsible Stakeholder speech. And for people in the China-watching community, China policy community, this really was an inflection point of sorts. It was an explicit acknowledgement that China's rise had reached a particular juncture where it was in a position to be more active in regional and global affairs, to be consequential in policy. And really the speech, I think, was an acknowledgement of that, but also a suggestion that our policy had to adapt to that. And after a decade plus of positive engagement, we needed to not only continue the engagement, but raise our expectations and challenge China to be a so-called responsible stakeholder. So 10 years later, we want to have this conversation today, which will, in effect, judge how we're doing, take a look at China's response to that challenge, and in various sectors, whether they have met the challenge, met our expectations, where they may be falling short. And we want to discuss if we're arriving at another potential inflection point, if there's something we need to do differently with respect to our approach to China, if we're not getting the outcomes that we want and they're not reaching the expectations that we set for them. So I think we have a good program today. We're going to start with my good friend Evan Feigenbaum, who I'll introduce more thoroughly in a moment. And then we'll move on to a panel of experts who will address different sectors, both internal to China as well as regional and global issues. And then we'll close with a conversation with two experts on China and the global commons, and really try to be more forward-looking and press them on policy alternatives. So with that, we will kick off with an opening speech by my friend Evan Feigenbaum. Evan currently serves as Vice President of the Paulson Institute. He previously worked in the private sector with the Eurasia Group. He and I worked together in government. He was at the Department of State, served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of South Asia and Central Asian Affairs. He also served in the Office of Strategy, Policy, and Planning. Evan also is an accomplished scholar, received his PhD from Stanford University, his BA from Michigan University, where he studied with one of the real legends in the China field, Mike Oxenberg. So Evan is, as we say, a gentleman and a scholar, but he's also had his impact on policy. Evan was in the Office of Policy Planning at the time this speech I mentioned was delivered. I think he had a role in developing the concepts, if not the speech itself, and certainly had a role in the follow-on implementation of that policy. So what we've asked Evan to do is to set the scene for the rest of our discussion today by giving us maybe a little historical background of the speech and the policy, and his experience at Department of State and beyond in terms of the early efforts to implement that policy. So if you would please join me in welcoming Evan Feigenbaum.
Great, well, thank you. As Randy said, we are old partners in crime. We go back to the mid-1990s when Randy was in the Defense Department, and I was a budding academic at Stanford writing a dissertation on defense industry in China. So it's a pleasure to do this with Randy. It's also a pleasure to do this with Project 2049. We've done some things before. Go back a long way with Mark Stokes, who I just saw in back. We've done some reports together on Central Asia and other things as well. So thanks for having me. Randy asked me to be reflective and then also look forward, to look backwards 10 years to the period around 2005 when Bob gave this speech, but then also to kind of bring the story up to now and think a little bit about what some of the concepts that were embedded in that speech might mean or not mean for the challenge we're facing with China today. So I thought, since I don't have a lot of time, that I would do this in 3 bites. First, I want to kind of rewind the tape, not just to 2005, but to the decade of the 2000s, because I would argue that that was a pretty important inflection point, both for China's role in the world, but also how the United States approached China as the issues and challenges that confronted us and the Chinese began to change a little bit. Second, having rewound the tape, I want to then fast forward the tape. And I want to talk a little bit about why, if you think about some of the things that are at the core of that concept in the speech, coordination between the United States and China turns out to be pretty hard on a lot of things. And I would argue it's going to continue to be hard pretty far into the future. And I'm going to reflect a little bit on why I think that's the case. I have a few theories of my own. And then third, since Asian architecture in particular is in the program, I just want to say a little something at the end, because it's a subject I talk and write a lot about. So I want to bring it back to the Asian story. Now, first, to rewind the tape to 2005, and I was in the policy planning staff of the State Department, but working very closely with Bob at the time, who was deputy secretary and had a very strong interest in China. It is, in a sense, we were talking about this before, kind of remarkable that we're still talking about this speech 10 years later. Having been around Washington a long time, there aren't that many speeches that you talk about 10 days later, 10 months later, much less 10 years later. And the fact that we are, I think, reflects the fact that there were concepts embedded in there that help us think a little bit about the challenge that the rise of China and of Chinese power generally confronts the rest of us with for the international system. China's a different kind of challenge, really, than anything that I think we've faced in a long time in international history. And so there's a need for concepts and a search for concepts to think about what we're wrestling with. Now, remember that, if you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, you rewind the tape even further, China was really a very different kind of power than it was today. It was really a revolutionary power in a lot of ways, talking about class struggle and proletarian solidarity, supporting revolution from Bolivia to North Borneo, and essentially opposing many of the major international institutions that have prevailed in the liberal order and in the international system in the post-war period since 1945. Now, if you begin to fast forward the tape from the 1960s, by the time you get into the 1990s and into the decade of the 2000s, China, of course, has joined many of those institutions that it once opposed. So the nature of its interaction with the prevailing order is a little bit different. And that, I think, begins to set a little bit of the context for the period in 2004, 2005, 2006, around the time of this speech. When I look back at that period, there are a few things that I think resonate with me, both about the notion of a responsible stakeholder as Bob used it in his statement, but also the ways in which China's interaction with international institutions and the international order was changing at the time. So let me just tick off a few of those. First, as I said, this was a moment where I think the predominant issues of the previous 20, 25 years began to give way to a somewhat different set of issues. The previous 25 years basically had largely been about China and the structure of the international order. And at this point, there was an inflection, I think, the transition from structure really to the choices China made and China's behavior within those institutions. And the reason for that is because China, frankly, had joined these. Rhetoric, in a lot of ways, around 2005 was still 5 to 7 years behind the reality of China's role in the international system. I remember being in the State Department, and Randy, you were there, you were Rich Armitage's chief of staff, and a lot of the rhetoric around China policy was still about working to integrate China into the international system. But structurally, China was in. China was in the WTO. China was a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. China was a signatory to protocols on everything from ozone depletion to chemical weapons. You pick your functional area. China had signed. So structurally, China was in, and that meant that the issue was less structure than behavior and choices, as China now had its seat at the table. And so the choices for China were really about how to articulate its interests now that it was inside rather than outside the tent. And I think for the United States, it was increasingly not just how to integrate China, but how to push this more integrated China to act in ways that were consistent with our interests and our values. Now, by the time you get to 2005, this is a particular inflection point because I think the last really great integration project of the previous decade had been completed, which was China's accession to the WTO, which was the negotiations completed in the period around 2000. China acceded in 2001. So with China now inside the WTO and structurally in most of these institutions, I think this kind of pivot point from structure to choice, from structure to behavior, was a kind of timely and interesting way to think about China's role in the world and what the challenges were for the United States as it interacted with China. Now, second thing was really, I think, the change from China as a regional player to much more of a global player. There was a global turn in foreign policy in China. Now, I don't want to over-determine or over-argue this. This is not to say that China hadn't had a global role previously. But I think the period kind of in the decade of the 2000s were, as I said, a bit of an inflection point for China in this respect. If you want to see this in action, let's just pick out a region. And I'd pick, say, Central Asia, because it's a region I know well, because as Randy said, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the region for a few years. So if you think about the period from 2000, when President Bush was elected, to 2008, when President Obama was elected, and you look at something like direction of trade between Central Asia and, say, Russia on the one hand and China on the other hand, there's almost a wholesale reversal as the lines of trade and percentages of trade for the region basically cross. I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I'm just going to ballpark them. Around 2000, China constituted about 3.9% of Central Asia's external trade. And Russia, by contrast, was 25, 26%. By 2008, 8 years later, when President Bush left office, China's had basically quadrupled to about 17 or 18%, and Russia's had shrank by a quarter over the same period. And those lines have continued to cross since then. In fact, if you look at the dollar figures, it's even more dramatic. China's trade in 2000 with Central Asia was, I think, lower than $2 billion gross. It was about $1.8, $1.9 billion. And by 2008 or 2009, it had grown 17 or 18 times in excess of $30 billion. And again, that's continued. And here I'm just talking about the direction of trade. Now, if you throw in infrastructure construction, project finance, a whole array of other metrics and indicators, China's role in regions that are on its periphery, but even beyond its periphery, changed appreciably during this decade. So I think this turn from kind of thinking about China only in the Asian context to thinking about China in a much more global context was, in my view, prescient and timely and has become even more relevant, as you all know, since then. Now, when people talk about Bob's speech in 2005, they tend to think just about the speech, and they forget about, as Randy, you called it the implementation, they forget about the follow-on architecture that came after it, which included an agreement between the United States and China to create an architecture of what were called sub-dialogues, focused on different regions of the world. There was one on Central Asia, there was one on South Asia, there was one on Africa. If I'm not mistaken, there may have been one on Latin America too. And ironically, after Bob left the department, I became Deputy Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia. And so I ended up conducting one of these dialogues that we had helped to create when he was Deputy Secretary. So, you know, that architecture of a much more global interaction, an attempt to think about interests, where they converged, where they did not converge, I think, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, actually looks quite ahead of its time if you think back to the period of 2005, and then you take a look at where we are today. Third, the issue of public goods provision and providing public goods, which really in a lot of ways is at the core of the speech. If you look at the section of the speech on energy, for example, where Bob talked a little bit about mercantilist policies versus reliance on the market, the notion of, quote unquote, locking up energy supplies around the world. This notion of essentially fungibility of commodities, the notion of economic public goods generally, was in many ways at the core of the speech. And not to be flip about it, but if you think about the term responsible stakeholder and then you try to think about its opposite, to me, the opposite of a responsible stakeholder is an irresponsible free rider. And the United States, by the middle of the decade of the 2000s, had every reason to encourage China to be the former and not to be the latter, not essentially to take a free ride off the public goods that others were providing, particularly as China's capacity and China's wealth were beginning to increase. Now, this kind of is interesting to think about in retrospect, because when I read the way people have written about this speech over the last decade or so, most of the critiques of the speech or the concept really have come from people who are, I would argue, most skeptical of US-China coordination on an array of issues. But ironically, that was not the case at the time. I don't know if any of you were in the room at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations dinner in New York in September 2005. You may have been. I see Bob Suttinger in the audience. I don't know if you were there. But actually, it was quite the opposite. The people that were most critical of the speech were actually those who were most enthusiastic about U.S.-China engagement, many of whom I remember actually turning green in the room, because the basis of the emphasis on public goods was that China needed to assume a burden of responsibility rather than simply be a free rider on the existing system. And that notion of putting a burden on China, expecting China to step up in ways that it hitherto had not, was, I think, it was seen as somewhat edgy by a number of people at the time who had been enthused about a different model of U.S.-China cooperation. I would also add that the concept was not meant to be static, and I don't want to speak for Bob, but I would say that if he were here, he'd probably say that it was not meant to be static. At the same time, it was meant to be dynamic. The international order would adapt, but it was nonetheless a conservative speech. And if that sounds contradictory on its face, to me, it's not. The speech was a recognition that as rising powers, particularly in terms of their economic weight, came to play a greater role in the world and had greater capacity, they inevitably would seek to change the system. And because of that recognition, this speech and this concept were, in a sense, a conservative defense of the existing order by encouraging China to, as Zoellick put it, support, sustain, and adapt the international system that had enabled China's success. So China, rather than seeking to replace the system wholesale, should recognize the benefits that it derived. It was, in that sense, a conservative defense. The last point I want to make on rewinding the tape is I think one reason that this concept resonated in the mid-2000s was because it coincided with a particular debate in China itself and among Chinese about China's role in the world. This was a period where you may remember there was a debate about concepts like peaceful rise or peaceful development associated with people like Zhang Bijian, who'd written an article in Foreign Affairs calling for China to rise peacefully. So the debate about peaceful development, peaceful rise, and the debate about responsible stakeholder, in some sense, coincided and crossed over with each other at the same period of time. So the concept, as Bob articulated in New York, actually, I think, sparked an interesting debate inside of China itself. And one thing that might be interesting to reflect on in the panel is where we are 10 years later in terms of those debates about China's role in the world inside China. You don't hear a lot about peaceful rise and peaceful development in China anymore. Instead, when you hear people talking about concepts, they talk more about things like new type of great power relations. So if you think about those, we've transitioned from an emphasis on the system and concepts that are systemic, peaceful development, peaceful rise within the system, to things like new type of great power relationship, which is really much more about bargains among and between powers. It's a less systemic and much more, I think, bilateral concept. Very, very different, and with very different implications, I think, for the United States and US interaction with China. Okay, so hopefully I put a few things on the table to discuss. Now, just to fast forward a little bit to now. How does China exercise its stake in the international system today? And frankly, why? I don't think I'm telling you anything when I say it's hard for the US and China to coordinate, harder than it should be on a lot of issues, even where the United States and China share interests. Why is that the case? Let me throw out a few ideas, and you can tell me what you think of these. First, I would argue that there's really just no scenario under which China could be a purely status quo power, full stop. Because even if China accepted the international order precisely as it is today, it would still want to reweight institutions, voting stakes, change governance mechanisms to give itself a greater voice, a greater role, and greater influence on outcomes and decisions. So in that very structural sense, there's nothing particularly status quo about China, even if it accepts the institutions as they are. Now, China's not alone in that. In fact, it's joined by several other emerging and rising powers around the world. I've spent part of my career working on India, for example. A democracy deeply ambivalent about the rise of Chinese power in many, many ways, but which nonetheless has joined China in creating an architecture of some new institutions around the world. The BRICS Contingency Fund, the BRICS Development Bank, calling for changes to the structure of the United Nations Security Council, reweighting of chairs and shares in the IMF, the World Bank, and Bretton Woods and multilateral development institutions. India has joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which I want to come back to at the end in a second. So all of this is a long way of saying that even accepting institutions and architecture as it is, there would still be an element of non-status quo-ness to China's interaction with them, and that's important. Now, as a practical matter, that poses a challenge for the United States, because to make changes that are designed to reflect the realities of 2016 rather than 1945, 1946, or 1966, pick your date in the past, we'll have to make some changes that inevitably are going to rub some people the wrong way. If you want to make this real, I'll give you an example. At the end of the Bush administration in 2008, I was working very closely with Dan Sullivan, who's now a fairly newly minted Republican senator from Alaska, but was then Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, on a kind of updated U.S. approach to global energy policy. This is something Dan, being from Alaska, was extremely interested in. The International Energy Agency, which was kind of the prevailing agency for consumers, it's not exactly a consumer analog to OPEC because it doesn't function as a consumer cartel, but it was was supposed to be the main institution for major energy consumers. Did not include China and did not include India, the two fastest growing energy consumers in the world. You might ask yourself rhetorically, what kind of international energy consumer organization does not include the fastest growing energy consumers in the world? And so there was some interest among Dan and others, and Secretary of State Rice and others, in trying to think about how to update the architecture to match it to current functional realities in terms of international energy consumption. Now, one problem was that IEA membership was linked to OECD membership in the IEA Charter. But another problem, frankly, was that to bring these new major consumers, China, India, others in, you would have to reweight the voting shares, essentially at the expense of Europe. And if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while since I've looked at this, but I think voting weights in the IEA, at least at that point, were linked to something like 1973 or 1974 energy consumption, making countries like Belgium and the Netherlands essentially energy superpowers, which they really had no business being given their size and their consumption profile. So inevitably, even an institutionally status quo China is not necessarily a behaviorally and procedurally status quo China. Now, a second point, and I think another reason that it's going to be challenging, is that China's enthusiasm for big institutions as a source of legitimacy, an emphasis on form, contrasts with a much more functional American approach to things. Americans, we tend to just be a very functional people. And so, if I think about the decade of the 2000s, take something like the Global Nonproliferation Architecture, where the United States was actually an enthusiast for informal, ad hoc institutions and initiatives like the Proliferation Security Initiative that were outside the existing informal structures, but nonetheless were designed to match form to functional problems. China has a somewhat different view of that, and I think that's going to continue to be a challenge. Since time is running short, I'll just make a couple more points. Third, there's just the fundamental collision in Asia between economics and security, and this has been a big theme of a lot of my writing and speaking over the last few years. In fact, in a lot of ways, I think this is the central strategic dynamic in Asia today. The collision between economics and security, which no longer run in parallel lines, so you can tell the story of Asia almost as a tale of two Asias, economic integration and then security fragmentation, often among the same countries and same partners. Now, this dynamic matters for the United States, but it also matters for the US-China relationship, because I think in many ways China has accepted prevailing international economic arrangements. They're very enthusiastic, for example, about WTO dispute settlement, partly because they win. They've beaten the United States, they've beaten the European Union. But if you look in the security area, and particularly in Asia, it's very clear that the United States and China have some clashing security concepts, not least on the South China Sea, but on other things too. And I won't dwell on that because I know you're going to do that on the panel. But I'm happy to talk about that if you'd like. A last point, I just think, and this is just from practical experience, and I think Randy and Bob and others in the audience who've been in government would agree with me. There's a challenge, I think, turning common interests into complementary policies. Just having common interests is not the end of the story, it's the beginning of the story. And in fact, for the United States and China, who do have some common interests around the world and in Asia and on security and on economics, the problem has been that to turn common interests into complementary policy, you have to overcome a series of other problems that have proved to be very difficult. Things like making sure that you have shared threat assessments about the scope and urgency of the threat that you face, dealing with countervailing interests that obstruct cooperation, even on issues where you share interests. I'll give you an example to make that real. Afghanistan. When I was Deputy Assistant Secretary for State for Central Asia, we had a base in Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia that was there principally to be a mobility and logistics platform to fight the war. And the United States and China certainly share an interest in a stable Afghan state that does not harbor or export terror. But if the route from point A to shared objective at point P means you have to get through B, C, D, E, F, G, that includes things like a NATO military presence on China's western periphery, NATO operations, US military operations, potentially more long-term access arrangements, that introduces a set of countervailing interests that make things harder. Likewise, North Korea. The United States and China, absolutely. Do they share an interest in denuclearization and stability? Sure. But the fact is China values stability more than denuclearization, and the United States values denuclearization more than stability. And so from my standpoint, that means that the United States is much more risk tolerant when it comes to denuclearization steps and measures that might risk stability in the North Pacific. That leads really to the last point I want to make, which is about Asian architecture. I do think that this is bigger than just a China story. And part of the challenge the United States has is that Asia is changing in very important, dynamic, and fundamental ways. And the region that it's going to confront us in 2025 will look very different from the region in 2015, much less 2005. And it will be difficult to rewind the clock back to 1985, given what's happened, particularly in the economic space in this region. The three issues I'd flag for you. One, as I said, the collision between economics and security. In the security realm, the United States has exercised leadership in Asia because it has been a provider of both security-related public goods and economic-related public goods in this part of the world. And in the security space, until China and Japan have a Franco-German moment, which is not on the horizon, the United States is, and as far as the eye can see, will continue to be an important provider of security-related public goods for this region. Through alliances, forward-deployed military presence, there are challenges making the right kinds of investments in our posture, in forces, in weapons and technologies, adapting to change. But in the economic sphere, there is no scenario under which the United States continues to play a role analogous to the one that it did in the 1960s or the 1970s. In trade, for instance, US trade with every country in Asia is increasing in absolute terms, but declining in relative terms. And the United States' role as a source of final demand on which export-led economies could essentially power their way to growth, a lot is going to change because Asian economies increasingly provide economic public goods to one another. And at a time when the tools of economic statecraft are under attack from both left and right in the United States, not just TPP, but the whole mix of tools, that's a challenge that the United States faces because, and this gets to my last point, the story of change in Asia is not just a China story. When you talk about architecture in the panel, I hope we recognize that the story of Asian architecture did not start in Beijing. It didn't spring from the head necessarily of Xi Jinping. China is trying to leverage many of these trends to its strategic and economic advantage. But in the 1990s, after all, it was Japanese bureaucrats, not Chinese, who came up with the idea of Asian Monetary Fund that didn't include the United States. Asia-only trade agreements, bond funds, swap agreements. This incipient Asian regionalism that the United States in the 1990s chose to squash would be much harder to do today under prevailing circumstances. So some Asian institutions that do not include the United States will advance, I would argue, regardless of American views and preferences. And what's more, Asia is becoming integrated, East, Central, and South, in ways that are going to change the map of the region. It will be more Asian than Asia Pacific, more continental than subcontinental, as East and South Asia become more strategically and economically intertwined. And its continental West, more Central Asian than Eurasian, as these former Soviet countries discover their Asian roots and become linked not just by Chinese capital, but Japanese capital, Korean capital, and so on. And the United States needs to think hard and strategically about how to position itself to maximum strategic and economic advantage in that new Asia. And this is something I've written and talked a lot about, and we can talk about it if there's time for Q&A. But why don't I stop there, and I hope that gave you some things to chew on. Thanks.
We're very grateful for that, Evan. That was a fantastic way to kick things off. If you'll allow us to do something that is inelegant, maybe since we're running behind, we can begin to set up chairs and Evan can take a few questions. So hopefully that's not too disruptive. It'll allow us to go seamlessly into the next panel. But Evan, if you're willing. Sure. Yes, sir. I think we have a microphone as well.
Bill Jones, Executive Intelligence Review. China is, of course, embarked, as you know, on this Belt and Road project, which is really changing the history for the whole region. And every time that President Xi comes here, he invites the United States to be a part of it, and nobody really says anything about it. In fact, for about a year, I think, people ignored it. Nowadays, you're getting conferences and the like on it. But it would seem to me that this would be a branching point, that if we took up that invitation, that would be a point of cooperation with China, which today is really lacking, and obviously something that's very important for them, which of course I think would enhance the value of the U.S. cooperation. Why aren't we doing something about it? And wouldn't this be a direction we could take to try and create some kind of a greater rapport on major issues that extend far beyond the U.S.-China relationship?
Sure. I'd say three quick things in response. One, I don't know what it means to be invited to join the Belt and Road, because the Belt and Road is a Chinese bilateral initiative, unlike a lot of other connectivity projects like the AIIB, for instance, which is multilateral. It's a development bank. This is largely a bilateral initiative funded by Chinese development banks and new funds. So the idea of a U.S. role in Asian connectivity, sometimes maybe working with China, makes sense, but the Belt and Road itself is largely a bilateral initiative. So it isn't as if you get an invitation to join the Belt and Road. It's also largely focused on contiguous countries in Asia at this point in time. So the question for the United States, which transitions to my second point, is what role do we want to play in Asian connectivity? And that was what I was trying to get at the end of my remarks. I think intellectually, strategically, bureaucratically, the United States is really not well set up for the new Asia that I was describing. Intellectually, we still have three separate foreign policies for Asia. We have one for East Asia that's largely focused on strategic balancing in China. We have one for South Asia that I think is still much too focused on the India-Pakistan dynamic. And Central Asia, that's Russia. It's been hard for the United States even to think about that in an integrated way with an Asia policy. Intellectually, it's a challenge. Bureaucratically, Central Asia, for example, is with East Asia at the Defense Department. It's with Russia at the National Security Council. It's with India at the State Department. The Pacific Command in Hawaii has half of Asia, including India. The Central Command in Tampa has Pakistan and Central. It's just divided. So we're not well set up. And I'm not talking about a gigantic reorganization of the U.S. government, which we all know is impractical. I'm just talking about a more coordinated execution of strategy across these artificial dividing lines that reflect an old map rather than a new map. That gets to my third point. Yes, that could mean working with China. For instance, I think the way the U.S. approached the IAB, frankly, was kind of petulant and childish, and had no chance of success. And therefore, I'm not a big enthusiast of policies that have no chance of success, where you kind of go to the mat over things you're not going to succeed on. However, the U.S. needs to think about connectivity organically and in a bigger way. It's not just about China. And that was the core point of what I was trying to make, that connectivity is the product of the actions and choices of many, many Asian countries. There's a demand-side pull, but there are also many sources of trade and capital. In India, for instance, the bulk of the infrastructure is being funded with Japanese capital, not with Chinese capital. The Delhi Metro, the Mumbai-Delhi Industrial Corridor, high-speed rail for Indian Railways, all Japanese capital and a Japanese project finance. So sometimes with China, sometimes with Korea, sometimes with a different configuration of states, the United States, which really doesn't do publicly backed project finance in the way that China and Japan does through JBIC, needs to think about how it works, particularly by leveraging public-private partnerships, to work in creative ways. Because otherwise, as I said, this can be a very different region. So I like your thought, which is that we need to take connectivity more seriously, but I think we need to think about connectivity as bigger than the Belt and Road. It's not just a Chinese invention.
We have a second quick one we can close with. Yes, sir. Microphone right.
Thank you. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, member of Reagan Foundation. I came in late, so I missed a lot of talk. I'm sorry, but I have two questions. Number one.
We're running a
Oh,
little
okay.
bit behind.
Okay. Can you comment on the unification of Korean Peninsula?
It hasn't happened, it doesn't look imminent, and it gets to a core thing I said, frankly, about security, which is, if I want to think about a new security architecture for Asia, people talk about security architecture, I always find that debate a little bit tiresome, because until China and Japan have a reconciliation that is analogous to France and Germany, which is nowhere near on the horizon, until the big questions like Korean unification and so on are resolved, it is hard to imagine a basis for collective or cooperative security in the Pacific. So I just say what I often say, there is no basis for collective security in the Pacific today. I'll repeat that, there's no basis for collective security in the Pacific today. And for that reason, most countries in the region will continue to look to the United States to be an important provider of security-related public goods in the region. So for the US, the choices we face include updating our posture, adapting our forces, technology investments to adapt to some of the new weapons and other challenges we face from China, from North Korea, from others. But ultimately, I think the principal challenges in terms of the way the region is changing, as I said when I talked about two Asias, are in the economic sphere. Because there I see the US falling way behind. There was a line people were using a few years ago that said, we're back in Asia. If you take what I said on its face, the United States is, as far as the eye can see, will continue to play a very critical role in security. But in the economic area, we will be challenged in new ways. I can make a case to you that we're further out than we were 5, 6 years ago. And I think that's the challenge of economic statecraft the US has to adapt to. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Really well done. Excellent. Thank you. Invite my colleague Rachel Barton from Project 24.